Hello, and welcome to this edition of History Speaks. I will begin with a disclaimer. I am not an architect or an architectural historian, so I won't be discussing the incredibly creative details and craftsmanship of the buildings Harvey Ellis designed here in St. Joseph. There are several historians in town today who could speak to those elements better than I can. I will instead be examining Harvey Ellis as a person, as an artist, and his impact on St. Joseph for those few years that he spent here. For more information regarding Ellis and his architectural design, I would suggest the book Reconfiguring Harvey Ellis by Eileen Manning Michels as a good starting point. St. Joseph is a city of impressive and historic architecture. We are a community proud of the structures we built over a century ago. These historic structures were threatened through urban renewal and continued redevelopment plans, keeping their importance and history in the forefront of the community's mind. When studying the buildings of St. Joseph, we are often directed to Edmund Eckel. Eckel was the premier architect in St. Joseph during what is often considered the golden age of St. Joseph architecture, between 1870 and 1920. We will be delving into what made that period so important, how and why these buildings were able to be constructed, and why Harvey Ellis is often the focus of architectural research in St. Joseph, despite his short time living here. Harvey Clinton Ellis was born in Rochester, New York, on October 17, 1852, to DeWitt and Eliza Ellis. He was the eldest of four brothers, the youngest of which passed away in infancy. Very little is known about his youth, but he was very artistic, drawing portraits, landscapes, and buildings he witnessed. Several of his early works are housed in the University of Minnesota special collections, and they show the evolution of his style and refinement of his talent through his childhood. While there's no supporting evidence I could locate, it is possible that Harvey Ellis traveled through Europe based on some of his earlier works. Alternatively, it's possible that he could have studied these architectural features in European culture through books, gaining experience in drafting the Gothic and Romanesque styles, which would later form the basis of his own unique architectural style. In June 1871, Harvey passed the examination to attend West Point Military Academy, but he was discharged in January of '72 for delinquencies. After leaving West Point, Harvey joined a group of artists in Rochester. He earned a living by teaching night classes while honing his skills with like-minded and talented artists who would later form the Rochester Art Club in 1877. Harvey Ellis was a founding member of this art club, and it is one of the oldest continuing clubs in the United States today. The same year, Harvey joined his brother Charles to form the architectural firm of H and C.S. Ellis. Harvey Ellis's artistic talent lent itself well to drafting architectural designs. From 1877 to 1885, the architectural landscape of Rochester was shaped by the Ellis brothers. They consistently made the news, Harvey with his art and Charles with his civic activities. Unfortunately, the Ellis family was struck with disasters in the mid-1880s, beginning with the loss of their mother, Eliza, in 1884. In January 1885, Charles was indicted on charges of bribery. The firm was attempting to secure the contract to construct the county jail, and he was accused of bribing city officials to secure that contract. The trial was a messy affair and heavily publicized. By March, Harvey Ellis had left Rochester for an odyssey across the Midwest, which would eventually lead him to St. Joseph, Missouri. Harvey first found his way to St. Paul, Minnesota, and then he later joined the firm of Leroy Buffington in Minneapolis in 1887. Buffington is remembered as inventing and patenting the method to create skyscrapers. With Ellis as his draftman, Buffington constructed many of the historic buildings in Minneapolis through the 1880s. It is apparent that Buffington and Ellis were close friends. When Harvey sought to adopt a child, Buffington provided a shining review of his character. These claims shifted as the drama of Ellis's family life came to light in the early 1890s, but we'll get to that in a moment. Harvey made a name for himself in Minnesota. His designs were published in architectural journals across the country, and his style was catching on as more and more cities sought to show their wealth with innovative and artistically impressive architecture. He had likely been scouted by Buffington, and his continued success in Minneapolis increased his job prospects across the Midwest. Draftsmen in the 1800s often wandered from city to city, taking up jobs in various firms as they passed through. Ellis's artistic capabilities granted him a higher opportunity of being sought out by firms. It is likely that he was hired to train other employees how to draft perspectives in his style. This is why many of his final products rarely follow Harvey's original designs precisely or had alterations done by other draftsmen. This is also why it is hard to accurately attribute buildings to Ellis. His style was often imitated intentionally by other draftsmen of Buffington and Eckel. In 1888, the St. Louis City Council established a City Hall Commission to pursue the construction of a new city hall for the city. A year later, they were authorized to advertise for bids for the building. From 37 national entries, the commission chose the design of Eckel and Mann of St. Joseph, a design drafted by Harvey Ellis. It was this project that brought Ellis to St. Joseph. He had been hired to draft the St. Louis City Hall for the competition, and once awarded, would have to be on site to oversee the project. While work commenced on the City Hall across the state, Eckel and Mann made use of Ellis's presence, taking out hundreds of commissions through the city of St. Joseph and St. Louis between 1889 and 1893. Our confirmation of Ellis's time in St. Joseph comes from the payrolls of Eckel and Mann. He first appears on the payroll in June of 1889 and was last paid in November 1890. During that time, he was the highest paid employee at the firm. Those 2 years saw the greatest construction projects in St. Joseph's history as the city's richest businessmen sought to show their civic pride and improve the style of St. Joseph's architecture. Nearly 1,000 building permits were issued by the city in 1890. Among those are some of the buildings and homes we'll be highlighting today. In January 1889, the German-American Bank had outgrown its original location at 114 North 5th Street. They purchased the corner of 7th and Felix Street and planned a grand modern brick building. Eckel and Mann received the contract to design the building, but the project was delayed as plans for a hotel behind the bank fell through. The influence of Harvey Ellis's presence in the office is clear with the Romanesque columns and friezes across the Buffington-esque skyscraper. In the same 1890 article, which heralded the German-American Bank building as one of the most perfect office buildings in the West, Eckel also describes the Central Police Station that they had recently completed as the finest building of its kind in the West, and a credit to the city. The St. Joseph Police Force consisted of 40 officers overseeing nearly 1,300 square blocks. They utilized the City Hall as a headquarters, and the workhouse housed the holding cells. The population of St. Joseph quickly expanded in the late 1800s, increasing the necessity of larger facilities and a larger force. The City Council unanimously approved the project in July 1890, and the building was constructed at the corner of 7th and Masseny Streets. Ellis's signed perspective of the Central Police Station appeared in Northwest Architects in August of 1890. The original design was a bit larger than the finalized project, but it shows that Ellis's design was followed to the best of the abilities of the space provided. The interior of the police station was finished in 1891 with expansions throughout the early 1900s. As part of the Works Program Administration, a new police headquarters was constructed in 1939. The Central Police Station passed through several hands and was the National Military Heritage Museum from 1989 to 2016. Another civic structure that aligned with the arrival of Harvey Ellis in St. Joseph was the Burns family mausoleum at Mount Mora Cemetery. James Nelson Burns was a U.S. representative from St. Joseph. In January of 1889, he collapsed on the House floor in Washington, D.C., and died the following day. His body was brought back to St. Joseph, and he was laid to rest in the city receiving vault at Mount Mora until proper resting place could be constructed. This historic structure would require the grandiose of an architect such as Harvey Ellis, and may have contributed to his transfer to the office of Eckel and Mann. As with the Central Police Station, Ellis's original plan for the Burns Mausoleum was grand, but due to the size restraints of the plot, the mausoleum had to be reduced. Throughout the 1890s, more and more grand mausoleums began to surround the burned structure, forming the historic Mausoleum Row that Mount Mora boasts today. Several historic homes constructed during Ellis's time in St. Joseph have been attributed to the architect. Again, it is likely that Ellis's design influenced most of the buildings constructed during that period, if not all of them, but the only evidence that we have to confirm Ellis's work are his signed perspectives. Through studying those, we can see what projects were planned and which ones were altered, which ones were actually constructed. Though Ellis worked on the main designs for many of these homes, those designs were either altered or redone completely by other draftsmen. The home of J.B. Moss at 906 Sylvania Street is one of the best examples of Ellis's style in St. Joseph. It is designed like a medieval castle with several towers and mosaics that make it unique to Harvey Ellis's style. Other great examples of Ellis's home designs are the homes of J.D. McNeely at 701 South 11th Street, James McAllister at 105 North 19th Street, which would later become the A.J. August House, and the Samuel Nave home at 2121 Clay Street. The McNeely and McAllister homes differ very little from Ellis's original design, but the Sam Nave home was altered to a smaller size by draftsman Ben Trunk in 1891. With the construction of the St. Louis City Hall underway, Eckel and Mann were operating separate firms in either city, with George Mann stationed in St. Louis and Edmund Eckel remaining in St. Joseph. Harvey Ellis spent much of 1890 traveling back and forth between the firms, but by 1891 the firms had split, with Mann remaining in St. Louis to oversee the City Hall project, and Ellis resettled with him there. This is why Ellis does not appear in Eckel's payrolls after November of 1890, and why from 1891 to 1893 St. Louis sees an explosion of Ellis's style across its civic structures. As in Rochester, Minneapolis, and St. Joseph, the city of St. Louis hired Harvey Ellis and the firm of George Mann to oversee the civic improvement of its city. From hospitals to clubhouses to water towers, the towers and medieval style of Harvey Ellis came to define St. Louis architecture. It is from these years that we get the clearest view of Harvey Ellis's personal life. Outside of his artistic prowess, Ellis rarely made the newspapers, so it's difficult to track his life movements and family affairs. However, during his time in St. Louis and St. Joseph, his family issues quickly became prominent. 1889 was a particularly difficult year for Harvey. In February, his younger brother Frank passed away at the age of 31. He came to work at Eckel and Mann that spring, and his father, DeWitt, passed away in October. These tragedies no doubt had an effect on Harvey and likely added to his notable alcoholism. The information we have comes from a series of sensationalized newspaper articles through the 1890s involving Harvey, his wife, and their adopted child. Tracing Ellis's personal life has proven quite difficult for me. In Michelle's book, she claims that Harvey was married, traveled to Europe, and annulled that marriage all in the 1870s, 1880s, but I have found no record of these events. Harvey does appear in the 1900 census in Rochester, New York, with his wife, whose name is Alice, and that claims that they've been married since 1885. That time would work out based on his brother Charles getting married in 1885 as well, which would be right after their mother passed away. But I have no record of Alice anywhere else. Harvey doesn't have a marriage record that I can find, and it might be that he didn't get married till 1887, so that date is kind of in question. The stories that we do know begin in August 1890. A Mrs. Zoe Ellis, wife of Harvey Ellis, and her son Charlie were escorted by George Siemens to St. Louis to find Harvey. George Siemens was a fellow draftsman at the firm of Eckel and Mann and would later write about his experiences with Harvey. It's one of the only first case reports that we have about Harvey's time in St. Joseph. At this point, Mrs. Ellis had assumed that Harvey had abandoned her with no money in a city that she was unfamiliar with. The couple fought and Zoe returned to St. Joseph with Siemens, leaving Charlie in the care of Harvey Ellis. It is claimed that Harvey went on a drinking spree, leaving the child alone in their hotel for several days. Charlie was placed in the house of refuge for a few days before being returned to St. Joseph to his mother. Zoe then returned to St. Louis with Charlie and George Siemens again. She rented a third-floor suite at the Lucas Place, but 2 weeks later, she gave Charlie to a Mrs. Josie Bass, a washerwoman who lived above the stables of the Missouri Historical Society. Since Mrs. Bass was a black woman, she was instructed not to allow Charlie to go outside or be seen by white citizens of the city. Within the week, Zoe Ellis claimed that she no longer wanted the child, and Mrs. Bass began to realize there was something terribly wrong. Charlie had bruising, and his legs were weak from being forced to sit on chairs most of the day, and he was most comfortable sleeping with the Bass family dog, as he had grown accustomed to such conditions while living with Zoe and her greyhound named Faye. Mrs. Bass thus encouraged Charlie to run around and go play outside with the other children to help increase his leg strength, and it's there that he gained the attention of neighbors who alerted the police to the situation. While the police were preparing to find Charlie a more appropriate home, Mrs. Bass was visited by George Siemens, who claimed to have been sent by Harvey to collect the child. Mrs. Bass was ordered by the police not to allow the child out of her custody, and so she refused to hand him over. Charlie was sent back to the Sheltering Arms in Minneapolis, where he had previously been adopted by the Ellis family. Zoe was interviewed at this time by the police, and they tried to find Harvey, but he was too drunk to be interviewed. And by the time that he sobered up, he had fled back to St. Joseph, and the police were not able to get his side of the story. In Zoe's interview, she was claiming that she was suffering from paralysis on her right side, and so she was sent to a hospital. When she learned that Harvey had gone back to St. Joseph, she had a nervous breakdown, believing that he had abandoned her once again. While being transferred to another hospital, she became so hysterical that the doctor sent her back to her boarding house. She told the interviewers that Harvey was abusive and rarely sober, blaming her paralysis on him choking her frequently. She claimed that he had abandoned Charlie and that the politicians and his friends were covering the stories up. It's a very sad tale from all sides, and there's no way to truly tell what is factual. It's very likely that Mann and Eckel kept Ellis's name out of the papers as much as possible for fear of losing their reputations. It's also likely that city officials in St. Louis who had hired Ellis to design their buildings would not want these stories to get out. However, as Zoe is the only person being interviewed and the papers were making a sensation out of all these events, there's an issue of the unreliable narrator. The papers were quick to point out that Zoe was possibly insane and tried to discredit her stories every chance that they could, which feeds back into her theory that Ellis's friends and city officials were trying to keep this under wraps. It's a sad and harsh reality of the times that women were often discredited. With little Charlie returned to Minneapolis, George Mann sought to aid Harvey and Zoe by having them agree to separate. The two were very volatile together, regardless of which side of the story you believe, and a divorce was prepared in St. Joseph by August 28, 1890. These reported Zoe's name as Zoe Fernandez, which is the first and closest name that we can account for her. This is where I thought the story ended, but it's only the beginning. In September 1893, Zoe Ellis attempted suicide in St. Louis by consuming 60 grains of chloral. She was taken to the city dispensary and her stomach was pumped to save her life. In the interviews with reporters who seemed to have followed her to the hospital and witnessed the surgery, as soon as she comes to, Zoe begins speaking to reporters. She claims that Harvey was living with another woman in St. Louis named Mabel Livingston, who had left him once she realized he was still married. When referring back to their divorce in 1890, Zoe claimed that she signed the papers under duress and they were never official. With the two sensationalized stories in the papers, I began to research and try to understand the reality of what was happening within the Ellis's family lives. We can confirm through newspapers that Harvey Ellis and his wife adopted a child in Minneapolis in 1888 who they named Charles Hazeltine Ellis after Harvey's brother and mother. The papers also covered the return of Charlie to Minneapolis, though several papers got the location incorrect as Indianapolis, but the other characters involved were definitely from Minneapolis. Through those narratives, we learn that the child was born Leonard Nicholson, the son of a Swedish immigrant whose husband had abandoned her whenever they arrived in New York. She took shelter at the Sheltering Arms in Minneapolis and had the child there in 1884. She named Leonard after a doctor who had cared for her. Mrs. Nicholson left the Sheltering Arms to find work, leaving Leonard to find a new family. In 1888, Harvey Ellis and his wife adopted the child. The papers reported that a Dr. Hall and Mr. Buffington gave their references to the character of the family. As we know, Leroy Buffington was Harvey's boss at the time and the most well-respected architect in the city. In the later articles, Buffington clarifies that he knew the Ellises to be volatile together and that he'd hoped that having a child would bring them together and help curb Harvey's alcoholism. After Charlie's return to the Sheltering Arms, his trail runs cold as he was likely adopted by a new family. Zoe has also proven quite difficult to track down. I cannot find the marriage record between her and Harvey Ellis, though it can be assumed that it occurred sometime between 85 and 87. After their attempted divorce, Harvey sent Zoe back to Rochester to live with her family. It's reported that she became addicted to painkillers, which later led to the suicide attempt in 1893. I continued to dig, finding a 20-year-old Zoe Fernandez in Philadelphia in the 1880 census, which may expand upon her story. Zoe claimed to have been born in Cordoba, Spain, which is verified by the 1880 census record. But she was abducted as a child and brought to America, where she was adopted by a family in Utica, New York. She does not give the name of the family that adopted her, and I cannot find any record of the incident or the adoption. Just after the 1880 census, she marries an actor named Charles W. Hayward. Unfortunately, that is his stage name, and Zoe refused to give her true name to the papers, which makes it nearly impossible to find either one of them. I have found that Charles Hayward was a minstrel and a vaudeville actor, performing in both male and female roles up to the 19-teens, at the very least, but I have not found his true identity yet. The reason that we have this information is through another set of sensationalized newspaper reports. Zoe Haywood arrived in Brooklyn in September 1883 in search of her actor husband, who she claimed had abandoned her. The police located Charles, who claimed to have been traveling for a role, and he was reunited with Zoe. Then, in November 1883, Zoe Hayward was rooming in the Mansion House in Baltimore when 6 shots were fired. When the police arrived, they found Zoe with a single bullet wound in her chest. Again, she gave the reason for her attempted suicide as abandonment by her actor husband. The incident made national news, but accounts were sketchy as to whether or not she was expected to survive. Zoe also claimed to have been expecting a child in 2 months. It's entirely possible that these are two completely different people. We cannot find Haywood's real name, so we do not know if and when they were actually married or divorced. There are no death records or anything to confirm the news stories. The story of her being abducted from Spain appears in both Zoe Haywood and Zoe Ellis's reports, and her flair for strained relationships, abandonment, and suicide attempts matches up across the narratives, which leads me to believe these are the same people. The timeline would match up with her being married to Haywood in 83. If they had gotten divorced a few years after that, then she definitely could have remarried Harvey Ellis by 87 or 88 whenever they adopted the kid. Her having been adopted by a family in Utica would also match up with her knowing the Ellis family in Rochester. And if she was sent back to Rochester after their alleged divorce, then these timelines also match up. The Panic of 1893 ended Harvey Ellis's time in St. Louis. He returned to Rochester and returned to work at the firm of his brother. The new century saw him enjoying the patronage of rich families until his untimely death in January 1904. Harvey's body went unclaimed for several days before the Rochester Art Club finally identified him and arranged his funeral. His brother Charles passes away in late January. I found no record as to what was the cause of his death, but it's possible that he was being treated in an insane asylum at that time, at least according to one of Harvey Ellis's obituaries. The few obituaries that do exist for Harvey list his brother and his wife as his only survivors, hinting that either Zoe or perhaps a new wife named Alice, according to the 1900 census, were still around at this time. Following his death, a woman named Merceda F. Ellis arrives in New Jersey, wandering the streets and claiming to be the widow of Harvey Ellis. She was taken to the Burlington County Insane Asylum, and detectives were assigned to her case, but again, the trail runs cold here. The questions surrounding Harvey Ellis's personal life have troubled researchers for decades. As with all history, this presentation is not a report of absolute facts, but a call to historians to dig deeper. We only know what the sources provide, and accessibility to records is increasing with each day. Hopefully, we will be able to learn more in the near future. I will try to post updates in this video's descriptions or in the comments, and if you have any additional information, please feel free to share them here. The life and art of Harvey Ellis is a fascinating subject. His time in St. Joseph embodied the spirit of the times, of rapid civic improvements with bold and unique structures and design that would bring national renown to the city. If you would like to learn more or experience the architecture that still remains in St. Joseph today, we have created a walking tour on the Clio app and a traveling exhibit through the St. Joseph Convention and Visitors Bureau located at 911 Frederick Avenue. Please feel free to contact them for more information and to start your very own journey through the history of St. Joseph architecture.